Hello and welcome to topic 3, lecture 1. And in this topic, we're going to be learning about federalism. So what are we going to be learning about in this lecture? Well, first we're going to define the concept of federalism. Then we're going to look at the way power can be divided in countries. Federalism is just one way of dividing power. There are other ways of dividing, so we'll take a look at the alternative models for dividing power. And then finally, we're going to talk about federalism in the United States Constitution and how the relationship between the national government and the states is outlined in that document. So let's go ahead and get started. This week, you're going to be learning about federalism, and we already touched on the concept of federalism in last week's lecture and information. Federalism is, one of the additional checks on the abuse of power that our framers put in the Constitution. As we know, they were really worried about power being consolidated in the hands of just one branch of government. They wanted to make sure that there was a lot of checks and balances on the use of power. And federalism falls into that category. What federalism is as it's defined in your textbook, it's a system of government in which power is divided by a constitution between a central national government and regional governments like states. And so, in other words, it's a power sharing relationship. That's what federalism is. In the United States, it's a division of power between the national government and the states. The national government gets some of the power and states get some of the power, and some of the power is shared. And so the idea with the framers, and we're going to look into this in more detail in a moment, is that it's better to diffuse powers. Don't give all the power to the states or all the power to the national government, but divide that power between those two entities. And so that's one way that you can divide power in a country. But there are other ways besides federalism that a government could choose in terms of how they want to divide powers. So let's take a look at these other models for dividing powers before we dig in more deeply into federalism. So federalism is just one way of dividing power within a country. There are other ways as well. And so, and one of the other ways you're familiar with, because our first constitution was based on that division of power. So let me put up the three models, and then we're going to dig into these a little bit more deeply. So one way of dividing power within a country is known as the unitary system for dividing power. Another model is the confederal system of power, and that's the one that you're familiar with, because that's the way power was divided in the Articles of Confederation. And then there's the federal way of dividing power. And as we know, the United States is a federal system. So the first system we're going to talk about is the unitary system. And I have these little diagrams here to help you sort of understand or at least visualize the way that power is divided within these different systems. You can see that this purple circle represents the national government, and then the light blue is state, and then local governments are in dark blue, okay? And so in a unitary system of government, that the way that basically, as you can see there, that the national government is sovereign. It is the biggest circle, and the other circles, the state governments and the local governments, they're basically subsumed by the sovereignty of the national government. In other words, power is like in the hands of the national government, and then the national government delegates the power to the sub-national units. The states or the provinces or the landers, like in Germany, if you have a federal system, they can't make decisions on their own. They only basically enact the decisions of the national government. So France is a really good example of a unitary system of government. In France, it's the national legislature makes the law, and then the provinces put those laws into action. And so, like in France, the national government sets the curriculum for all of what students are going to be learning in France, right? So, the joke is sort of that in France, like if you're in fifth grade, at 2 p.m. on the second Wednesday in October, every fifth grader in France will be reading this particular essay and engaging in these certain sorts of math problems, right? Power is set at the top, okay? And it's delegated to the subunits units of power. You can kind of understand why our framers didn't choose a unitary system of power, because power is really centralized in the hands of the national government. You got to hope that the national government is making good decisions, because if not, and not abusing powers, because if they are, they can really abuse power in a way that is somewhat unchecked and can harm others within that nation. So there are some benefits to the unitary system. I mean, one benefit is that there's uniformity across the country. In the United States, because we have a federal system, and when it comes to criminal law, like in the United States, we have federal criminal law, but then we also have state criminal law. And so, crimes are defined differently, state from state from state, and so our punishments are defined differently, state to state to state, and also punishments in the federal system. So let me give you a concrete example. If you are convicted of a capital offense, you can get the death penalty, right? The federal government uses the death penalty as a form of punishment. Now, the states are different. Some states, if you commit first-degree intentional homicide with aggravating factors, you can get the death penalty. But in other states, you can engage in first-degree, a homicide with aggravating factors and not get the death penalty, right? Like in Wisconsin. And so, in a way, there's a downside of the unitary system, not just with the criminal law, but there's not uniformity across the country. There may not be uniformity in terms of funding for certain programs, and so we don't really have a national paid leave system, but some states do, but some states don't, right? And so there lacks uniformity. An upside of the unitary system is who to hold accountable, right? I mean, in our system, you could sort of blame the national government or the state governments for not doing their job, right? And also, if you want to make change, you could try to make change in the national laws. And if you're not successful there, you might go to the state laws, right? And try to, lobby state legislatures. In the unitary system, who to blame, or who to give accolades to, who to praise, right? If we like our federal laws in France, then we praise the federal legislature. If we find that their laws are, bad laws, then we know who to hold accountable and who to kick out of power, okay? And also, the unitary system, you can sort of be nimble in terms of the way you respond to a crisis, right? If there's a crisis, the national government will take action. In the United States, if there's a crisis, well, you kind of got to, work with both the national and the state governments and the local governments to address that crisis, okay? And so there are some clear upsides and downsides of the unitary system, but it's clear why our founders didn't choose it, because it's really consolidated power, centralized power, and they were worried about power being abused. The second method for dividing power is what's known as the confederal system, and we are familiar with that. And that, as we see here, it's the subnational units of government that have most, if not all, the power. And then the national government can only do what the states allow the national government to do. We are familiar. So confederalism, the states or the subnational units are supreme, and that the national government is basically a creation and a servant of the states. That, as we saw under the Articles of Confederation, that the 13 original states were, basically equal partners in decision making, and you had to have a super majority of the states to actually get things done, to do things, right? And that, in a way, that's good because it's a real decentralization of power. That states are seen as this equal players, and they have to work together to get anything done. But we also saw the downside of that with the Articles of Confederation, that it really hamstrung the national government. They weren't able to address national crises, or even, they weren't able to, deal with international partners in a distinct and focused way. Couldn't raise debt to pay off our war debts, right? And it created conflict between the states as well, which led to being distable, okay, as a nation. And so we know what confederalism is. We know what the upsides are because it diffuses power, but we also know what the downsides are as well. And this leads us to the type of system that we have in the United States for dividing power, which is the federal system. So here you see that the national government is has its own powers, okay? And then the state governments have their own powers. So there's some things that only the national government can do in the United States. There's other things that only the state governments can do. And then there's some power sharing that there are powers that both the national and state governments have, such as the taxing authority. And then you'll notice here, local governments aren't even mentioned in the United States Constitution. It's the national government and states. And it depends on what state you live in, but that states, local governments are basically, beholden to the state governments, that they are, servants of the state. And most local governments can't do anything but enact state power. They don't have a lot of home rule or home authority. You'll read more about that relationship in your textbook. But getting back to federalism, as we know, it's power is divided between the national and the state governments, that we find that division of power within the Constitution, which we're going to look at in a moment. And each level possesses autonomy in terms of making decisions. Okay. So there's some things that the national governments cannot dictate to the states, and there's some things that the states cannot dictate to the national government. They have some autonomy and separate powers. So why federalism? Why did our framers include federalism or choose federalism as the power sharing relationship? Well, so it fits in really well with our lectures from last week and the architecture of democracy. And so federalism places checks on power, okay? But it also creates kind of a vibrant environment for getting things done, okay? And so, for the separation of powers that we learned about last week, you have the legislative power, the executive power, and the judicial power, and that there's, kind of works with human nature. So it's sort of like, here's the powers of the legislative branch, here's the powers of the executive branch, here are the powers of the judiciary. And if one of the branches tries to dance in the lane of one of the other branches, they push back. Right. So if the executive branch starts coming in and the lawmaking branch will push back and say, hey, get out of our lane. OK, so in a way, it's, yes, it's a check on power, separation of powers. But it's also, a way of sort of harnessing energy in order to get things done, because people are really committed to their lane. Federalism falls in that, that same idea of separation of powers. It isn't separation of powers, it's federalism, right? Because separation of powers is separating the powers of government, not necessarily defining what the relationship of different governments within a country are, okay? Federalism is that. What's the relationship between the national government and state governments? But federalism is this sort of pushback, this pulling and pushing in the sharing of power. That, yes, it does diffuse power between different institutions and regions, okay? And so state legislatures have power and the federal legislatures have power, and they can do things. But also, because we have all these state legislatures that have powers to make some decisions, a lot of decisions about how things should be done in their state, that they might try things out in their states, like little laboratories of democracy. And it might work, and then the national government might look at it and say, that's a good idea, we'd like to adopt it, right? It also, pushes, if the states try to do things that they're not supposed to do, the national government comes in and says, nope, you can't do that. And vice versa. If the federal government is doing things it's not constitutionally allowed to do, states will push back, okay? And so it does keep that check and balance on power, because that power is diffused throughout the nation. So there is this sort of healthy competition between states and national governments that can make for a more vibrant democracy, as long as that competition does not get sort of like lead to gridlock or lead to sort of, polarization between the states and national governments, which we've seen historically with the Civil War. But that it can be a healthy form of competition, but can also be a negative form as well. So I think sometimes when students see that title of this chapter, federalism, they're sort of like, oh my God, ho-hum, boring, right? But everything as you read on, in the chapter, you're going to find that federalism, as it says here with my magic pen, the federalism is actually pretty darn exciting, believe it or not. And in fact, one of your citizenship and action papers that you could choose for, you write 2 of them, and there are all these different topics that you can choose from. And that one of the topics is to listen to this documentary about federalism and then write a paper on it. And I have so many students who choose that topic because initially federalism seems sort of dull, but it actually deals with some pretty exciting issues. And those exciting issues are displayed here on this slide. So a big question, that deals with federalism is like gun laws, drug laws, in particular, marijuana, marriage laws, now abortion laws, as well as we see the overturning of Roe v. Wade, and also climate change, dealing with carbon emissions and controlling carbon emissions. And so as you're going to see, in federalism, that it's always this question about who has the authority, right? Is it the federal government that has the authority to set federal laws regarding gun control, or does that fall to the states, right? It's like, who has the authority? Who has the authority for defining, what is legal and not legal in the United States as it relates to recreational jobs, or not jobs, but drugs? So as you know that, right now, marijuana is still a controlled substance, right? And that if the DEA wanted to come in and bust a dispensary in Colorado or Illinois or California, the places that it's illegal, they could do that. They could still do that, right? But many states have legalized it, right? And so there might come a point where we really think that the authority for keeping marijuana illegal, that it's really not in the proper hands of the federal government. It should be left to the states. The Supreme Court in the Obergefell case, which we're going to be learning about later in the semester, that says that people have a constitutional right to get married and to choose who they want to be married to, as it relates specifically in Obergefell to same-sex marriages. That's seen as a constitutional right. Prior to that being deemed a constitutional rights, that was a matter that was left to the states. But then when the Supreme Court ruled that yes, you have the constitutional rights, states had to change their laws. Well, maybe in the future, got rid of Roe, maybe the Supreme Court will overturn Obergefell, and then the power will go back to the states, okay? So, and the whole thing about climate change, who has authority, who should have authority over regulating carbon emissions. So when you really dig into it, the topic of federalism is really quite fascinating and interesting, and I think you'll find it too. Okay, so what is federalism and how is it defined in the United States Constitution? Because we are a constitutional democracy, and that means the powers of the government and the limits placed on the power of government are outlined in the document. That document is the U.S. Constitution, so it's in the Constitution. So where do we find federalism? We find it several places. One place that we find federalism is in what is known as the expressed powers, okay? So these are the powers that are exclusive to the national government. Only the national government can engage in these sorts of powers. A really good example of the expressed powers, and we're going to be learning about the expressed powers of the Congress, of the presidency, and the judiciary throughout the course of this semester. But a really good example of the express powers of the national government, it can be found in Article 1, Section 8 of the United States Constitution. And basically Article 1, Section 8 is telling this Congress, it's telling the national lawmaking branch what powers they can engage in, have the legal authority to engage in. And so, only Congress can coin money, only Congress can declare war, regulate commerce, raise a national army, punish counterfeiters, etc. There's 27 powers in Article 1, Section 8. And so it's basically saying this is a power that is expressly given to the national governments. States cannot declare war without, having to leave the nation, right? Leave the union, like during the Civil War. Only, states can't coin money, etc. So express powers in the Constitution. This is telling us what government, the national government can do. It's their powers. Now, we do have the express powers, those powers that are explicitly written down in the Constitution, saying these are the powers of the national government. However, we also have this thing called implied powers, okay? And the implied powers are the national powers that are not explicitly outlined in the Constitution. There are both implied powers for the executive branch, but there are also implied powers for the legislative branch, for Congress, and that's what we're going to focus on here. And so the implied powers are saying that there are powers that are granted to the United States government. However, they're not explicitly stated in the Constitution. And so they are powers that are derived from the express powers, but they're not actually enumerated or listed in the Constitution. When the states were asked to sign on to ratify the United States Constitution, the anti-federalists, those who were a little bit nervous about ratifying this Constitution because they felt that it gave too much power to the national government, was really worried about this so-called implied powers. And it's found at the very end of Article 1, Section 8. And it basically, the language is there, that Congress can make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, the powers that are above in Article 1, Section 8, and the other clauses, and all other powers vested by this Constitution and the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof. So the necessary and proper clause is sometimes referred to as the elastic clause. Why is that? Well, that's because the necessary and proper clause is sort of used to take an expressed power in the Constitution and stretch it so that it applies to something that is related to that express power, but is like actually not specifically enumerated in the Constitution. And here's two cases that, that are one is the first case, McCulloch versus Maryland. It's a really important case as it relates to the necessary and proper clause, because it's the first time that the Supreme Court of the United States sort of answers the question about whether or not Congress can do things that aren't explicitly written in the Constitution. McCulloch versus Maryland is about the establishment of the National Bank. And there was a branch of the United States National Bank in the state of Maryland. And the state of Maryland was kind of pissed off about it, and they started taxing this national bank. And then, so dispute arises. One, whether or not the United States can even create a national bank, because there's nothing in this Constitution that explicitly gives that power to the Congress. And also whether or not, states can tax federal entities like national banks. And so as the question before the court was, does Congress have the authority to establish a national bank? And John Marshall, the Supreme Court Justice, the Chief Justice at that time, said yes. And it's a really important case because it's basically saying that there's this clause called the necessary and proper clause, and it really gives Congress a lot of power to do things that aren't explicitly stated in the Constitution. That second case there, the National Federation of Independent Businesses versus Sebelius, 2012, that's a case that also deals, it's a contemporary case that deals with the necessary and proper clause. That case is about Obamacare, or the Affordable Care Act. And the question about when that law was created was whether or not Congress has the power to require most Americans to purchase health insurance. I know you guys are young and you probably don't remember the enactment of the Affordable Care Act, but there was a real big controversy because in that act it said that you had to have health insurance. If you didn't have health insurance, you had to pay a penalty. So the question came to the Supreme Court because there's nothing explicitly in the Constitution that gives Congress that power. And so they said, hey, Congress doesn't have that power. But the Supreme Court, and Chief Justice John Roberts is the one who wrote this ruling, said that, and he's conservative and he made a lot of conservatives mad because of the way he ruled, basically said, that Congress has the authority to tax. And this is just an example of a tax, so sort of taking the taxing authority and stretching it to apply to a penalty for not having health insurance. And so therefore, that this law is in fact constitutional, thanks to the necessary and proper clause. Okay, so we have the express powers that are expressly granted to the national government, found in Article 1, Section 8. And then we have the implied powers that expand upon those powers, the express powers in Article 1, Section 8, and we get that through the necessary and proper clause. And we have the final category of powers is what's known as the reserved powers. That is the powers that are reserved to the states. So when the Constitution of the United States went to the states and the states had to ratify the Constitution, a lot of states were like, well, wait a second, we are not going to ratify this Constitution unless you add a Bill of Rights, okay? And we're going to be learning more about the Bill of Rights next week. So the Bill of Rights is the first 10 amendments to the United States Constitution. And the whole idea of the Bill of Rights is to place some brakes on the power of the national government. And one of the important amendments is the last amendment in the Bill of Rights, the 10th Amendment. And this is an amendment that basically says that it says that powers are reserved to the states. And so the language of the 10th Amendment says that the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. In other words, that the powers that are not delegated expressly to the United States, or in the Constitution, it also says that these are some things that states cannot do, okay? That unless states are told explicitly that they can't do it, or that the power is given explicitly to the national government, then that power is reserved for the states. And that's a big thing. So that's where the power of the states come. So when you think about that diagram that we looked at earlier about, you had the purple for the national government and the light blue for the states, that bubble of light blue, that is the reserved powers, also known as the police powers, that comes through the 10th Amendment. And it's called the police powers not because it's like powers to have law enforcement, although that's actually part of it. But states, the reserved powers are oftentimes regarded as these coercive powers to regulate the behavior of citizens. Most of the regulation of the behavior of citizens, including criminal law, is delegated to the states, right? The federal government can do some criminal law, but usually it has to do with national security or terrorism or the counterfeiting of money or something that interferes with interstate commerce. Everything else is pretty much reserved to the states. And so, regulating a behavior that's considered either criminal or immoral, health standards such as licensures for doctors, safety standards as a result, regarding zoning and those sorts of things. All of that, falls to the states. Curriculum, schooling, those sorts of things. Okay. It's not to say that, the national government can't get involved somewhat on safety. Right. I mean, sometimes the national government will set a standard like through OSHA about workplace safety, but it's really left to the states to sort of live up to those federal standards, and you'll be talking about that or learning more about that in the textbook in this chapter this week. Okay, that's it for this lecture. And so in the next lecture, we're going to be taking a look at the relationship between the national and state governments in terms of this power sharing relationship and how it has changed over time. In other words, we're going to be looking at the eras of federalism. Thanks for your time and attention, and I'll talk to you again soon.